So up next we have Heath Ramsey with BlueCat. He's going to be talking about IPv6 solutions in the enterprise. And I'll let you go from here.
Thank you very much. Thank you for everybody for giving me a little bit of time to talk to you today. You'll see that the title of my presentation is IPv6 Made Easy. And that's exactly what happens when you let product management or marketing create a presentation for you, because it's not quite exactly how it is. My name is Heath Ramsey. I am the Director of Global Enablement at BlueCat. And my job is around product training and solutions training for BlueCat Networks, which is a DDI company. So my challenge with IPv6 these days is really trying to figure out how we get over what I call the education curve around IPv6. And by the education curve, I know most of you here are probably over it already, but you remember those days of IPv4 to IPv6, and you were thinking, my gosh, if I only had something like a Rosetta Stone or some type of quick translator to get me from IPv4 to IPv6, I would be happy and life could go on. And then we realized just how different IPv6 is from IPv4, and then we take the appropriate steps to be trained. So that's really what we're working on right now at BlueCat from an education perspective. And before you get too worried that the guy in the jacket is going to give you the sales pitch on a product, that's really not what I'm here to do. I'm really here to talk to you, again, in the context of the holistic migration and how one component of that migration, which happens to be DDI, which we'll talk about in a little bit, can not only become an important part of your migration, but can also help your migration at the same time. So before we get started, how many people here know what DDI is? We've got a few people out there. Once I actually tell you what DDI is, it's sort of like cheating. You guys really do know all this already. But we'll talk about what is DDI, we'll talk about how it relates to IPv6, and then ultimately we'll talk about the DDI and the enterprise IPv6 migration. So DDI, expanded out, it's DNS, DHCP, and IPAM. But it's the industry basic term that people are using to lump those things together. Now that you know what DDI is, how many of you are using an integrated DNS, DHCP, and IPAM solution in your environment? Okay. So the challenge with DDI is that DDI itself, if I could get it to advance here, DDI together is about the management of the name and addresses in your infrastructure. And when you think about what that means for an IPv6 migration, it becomes pretty important. Today when we think about DNS, maybe we have a DNS server sitting somewhere on our infrastructure. We certainly have our external DNS and our internal DNS. We've got our DHCP servers out there that function in isolated islands. And you have to take all of those individual pieces, you need to bring them together into an infrastructure that's going to matter with respect to IPv6. So DDI itself becomes pretty important when you start thinking about how you're going to get from point A to point B. So IPAM itself, the way that we break it down at BlueCat IPAM, we have addresses in the IPAM and the DHCP layer, and we have names in the DNS layer. And these, of course, are all related to one another. You know that an IP address maps to a host name within DNS. You know that when you have a DHCP address that's handed out and you want to give that device a host name, you're going to use dynamic DNS. All of these things do relate to one another, and it's important to understand the relationship. And as we'll talk about later, it's also important to leverage that information in an IPv6 migration. So when you have a dynamic host, you've got the DHCP address that's given out, and then you've got the host name and DNS, obviously, when you're using dynamic DNS. If you have a static host, you're putting the information within DNS, but you're probably keeping track of the mapping somewhere in a spreadsheet as well. How many people here are using spreadsheets to track IP addresses in their environment? Okay. How about databases, custom-grown databases? Okay. And then finally, when we start talking about networks themselves fall into the IPAM category. So when you start pulling all this information together, and you think about how you need to document and get all of your IPv4 space to understand where you are, and then figure out how that's going to map into IPv6 into the future, that's what DDI and IPv6 are all about. So specifically, how DDI relates to IPv6, on the DNS side, if you guys are looking to implement IPv6, you obviously need to have a DNS server that supports IPv6. And this means that you need to have a DNS server that supports Quad A records, and you need to be able to map those to hosts. How many people here feel like they have their DNS server IPv6 capable? Okay. How many people here are running Bind? How many people here are running Microsoft? How many people are running nothing at all? I'm not seeing every hand go up, so I'm trying to figure out what you guys are using. Most implementations of DNS today, most of the popular ones are IPv6 enabled. So you probably are okay there. On the DHCP side, we probably shouldn't talk just DHCP anymore, because we have DHCP, and what else do we have in the IPv6 space? Slack, exactly. And this is, as you guys know, still a little bit of a war that's raging at this point. Are you going to go Slack? Are you going to go DHCP v6? And that becomes an important decision. But when it comes to how you are going to approach your IPv6 address assignment, having DHCP v6 and having your server be capable of assigning DHCP v6 addresses also becomes important. And then finally, on the IP address management side, being able to track all of your networks. How many people here feel that remembering IPv6 addresses is going to be as easy as it was in IPv4? There you go, somebody in the back who has a very good memory. I'll tell you, when I was a network administrator many moons ago, I won't admit how many moons that was, I still remember the IPv4 addressing scheme of the organization that I used to work for. And I can rattle off the name servers and the NTP servers and all those things. And I'm guessing that most people in this room probably can as well for the networks that they manage. IPv6, I've played with it. I think I can probably tell you the documentation space. But if you were to ask me to remember every address of a network that I was going to manage, I don't think that I'd be able to do that. Some of that might be just because of the many moons that I talked about and the fact that I might not have the mental faculty to do it anymore, but it does become a little bit more complex just because of the size of the addresses. So in relating to an IPv6 migration, it's obviously critical to an IPv6 migration for you to have this core component and this core foundation to be able to work from. So let's talk specifically about DNS, DHCP, and IPAM and an enterprise migration. I like to think of the IPv6 migration as a journey. So we've got a globe here. I like to travel internationally, so you'll see that I have not chosen as my destination somewhere within the United States. I did choose, if my geography is correct, somewhere approximately France, I believe. But in terms of IPv6, we're all going to the same destination. The question really comes down to, where are you starting from? If you don't know where you're starting from, how can you possibly plan the trip? Because your starting location completely affects how you are going to get there. In the case of my trip to France, if I'm coming from, say, Scandinavia, which was that first X that popped up, I have a lot of different options in terms of travel. I can take my car, I can take a train, which really then impacts and affects what I need when I actually get to France. Because if I take my car, I don't need a rental car anymore. So I'm saving a little bit of budget there, that's great. If I'm coming from, say, Australia, on the other side of the world, I need to coordinate plane flights and logistics and customs and all these different things that are important and are critical as part of my trip. Going back to our migration strategy, if we don't know where we're starting from, how do we know if we need a rental car when we get there? How do we know what kind of flights we need? How do we know how we're even going to get to the airport? And the answer is we don't. So DDI itself can have a very important effect to you because it can allow you to document and understand where you are in your IPv4 network. And if you know where you are in your IPv4 network, you'll be able to get to IPv6. So we'll look at a roadmap for DDI that hopefully can help you in your IPv4 to IPv6 transition. We start with the discovery, which is knowing that state. Are you in Australia, or do you happen to be in Belgium and you really have a very short trip to be able to get to France? So you'll go through and you'll figure out what do you have in the IPv4 space. And don't just limit it to what kind of devices you have and what kind of addresses you have. You also need to understand up and down the protocol stack all the things that you use that you need to assess for IPv6. So it's not just your DNS server, your DHCP server, your IPAM. It's obviously your routers and your switches, all the things that we've been talking about today, but your security monitoring software and all those other services that need to be IPv6 aware at the same time. So know where you are and know what you need to potentially, what your gap is between IPv4 and IPv6. After that comes your planning. So what kind of IPv6 capabilities do you need? And especially on the DNS and DHCP side, we'll talk a little bit about that, Slack versus DHCP v6. After you plan it, you want to model it. Make sure that you have your address space and that you are allocating it appropriately for all the sites or all the networks that you need to create for IPv6. After that, you map it. What is your IPv4 space going to look like versus your IPv6 space? And then finally, implementation, which a lot of the things that we've talked about today already. Are you going to do dual stack? Are you going to do tunneling? Are you going to do translation? We would tend to advocate as a DDI company that it really is a good thing to do dual stack, because if you have the right DDI solution, you'll be able to track all that information within a central database, and you'll be able to say, okay, this device has this IPv4 address, along with these 2, 3, or 4, or however many IPv6 addresses that you want to assign to the device, depending upon what it is. So where are we today and what you should be doing? Well, I think everybody usually turns to the experts when they're looking for additional information, and that specifically one of those experts is Gartner. And Gartner says that in that 5-point plan, today, for you to be where you need to be for an IPv6 migration, you should have completed those first 2 steps. So that really is the discovery and the planning. So if you have not done these 2 things by today to be ready, doesn't mean that you are going to fall behind. It just means that you have a little bit of extra work to do to be able to catch up and get hopefully to where everybody else is. Not that you want to be like the Joneses, be like everybody else, but there's something to be said for moving en masse and being about at the same place as everybody else. So what does this mean in this 5-point plan when it comes to DNS, DHCP, and IPAM? Well, what it means is that when you start discovering, you want to try to centralize as much of this information as possible. And I'm going to. Good. What looks good on my LCD screen actually looks okay on the screen, so that's a huge plus there. So where can you get this information? Well, you can get the information from your DNS servers, your DHCP servers, your spreadsheets or your databases that you have out there. And you can also get it from your network discovery tools if you have them. So, and when you pull all of this information together, you guys are well aware, people who are familiar with DHCP and familiar with DNS, a lot of times this information and these data are very siloed. And when you finally pull them into a central database, you begin to see some of the overlap and you begin to see some of the interdependencies in this addressing information that you have on your network. And this is important because when you also think about DNS and DHCP and IPv4, how old in general is that data? Anybody have any ideas? It's pretty old, right? I mean, there's probably things in there that some employee did 10 or 15 years ago that people are afraid to touch because it might break something. So you get to look at this information, you get to pull it all together, and ultimately you get to clean it. I heard a few speakers earlier today talking about cleaning and making sure that you throw out the stuff that you don't need anymore. That's exactly what you can do here when you start doing this discovery process. After that, you want to plan. And planning, my goodness, planning is going to be far more complex than what I show you on the slide right here because I'm looking at it from a DNS, DHCP perspective. But you need to plan. Specifically around DDI, DNS, and IPv6. What is your strategy going to be? I heard in one of the panels, somebody mentioned that the first time that Facebook went up, it was www.ip6.facebook.com or something like that. You need to make those decisions for your organization about how you're going to set up your DNS infrastructure, both your external space and your internal space at the same time. Most people, I believe, are going to go for an A record and a quad A record all on the same name because I think that makes a lot of sense. But from a troubleshooting perspective, you may still want to have a dedicated IP6 zone that has quad A records only and an IP4 zone that has A records only. And the reason for that is troubleshooting. Because if you really want to know you're getting the right record, you can go specifically to that zone. You're probably not going to advertise those names very much at all, but it is a way for you guys as professionals to be able to understand the communications and what's going on underneath there. On the Slack and DHCP v6 side, well, you don't have to have DHCP v6. It's not necessary. And in fact, there's a lot of advantage to Slack. But you may decide as an organization, due to compliance efforts, due to being able to track devices and addresses back to specific places at a certain point in time, you may still like that idea of a stateful DHCP, stateful IPv6. So again, you need to look at your business requirements and figure out exactly what do I need to do here. And part of your network may be Slack and part of your network may be DHCP v6. That certainly can be an option, but there's a lot of flexibility there. So plan your network and figure out what it is that you're going to do with that. Step 3 is the modeling. And this is really where a DDI tool comes into play, because if you have a good tool with a central database that is allowing you to discover and store all this information centrally, and the same tool allows you to model your IPv6 space, you're way ahead of the game. So you can take your plans for your IPv6 networks, you can put them in the tool, and you can start to figure out what your networks are going to look like. How many bits are you going to assign to this type of organizational structure? How many bits are you going to assign to this organizational structure, et cetera? And not only that, you can say, well, this is going to go to the Toronto office, this is going to go to the Miami office, this is going to go to the London office. So you can begin to see what these networks are going to look like without actually having deployed them yet out there in production. So it gives you an opportunity to play and to work with things in a, well, I will even say a test capacity before you ever really affect your production network. So with that kind of tool, hopefully the type of tool that you're looking for will allow you to manage IPv4 and IPv6 in the same tool. That's obviously important. You can organize your network space. And this idea of bringing your business logic into your IPv6 planning is important. Don't get lost in the bits and the bytes, because I do all the time. I immediately start thinking about, okay, how many bits am I assigning here, and what is this network going to look like? You need to make sure that this is integrated in a way that non-technical people are going to understand, because ultimately you're going to have to explain it to them at some point. And then, of course, being able to track every IPv6 network in your model, but ultimately tracking every IPv6 network in your organization once it's in production. Fourth step is the mapping. And this is, there are people who are far smarter about this than I am, who I will let you hear from them instead. But this whole idea of understanding IPv6 and how you're going to map from IPv4 to IPv6. And what I mean by that is maybe you have 11 networks like they do over on the left side today, but you have an opportunity to not have the same limitations in network design in IPv6 that you did have in IPv4. So again, this is a great opportunity for us. Everybody remembers that add the easy button. Like, make it be the easy button here. Give yourself the opportunity to hit reset and go forward new, because your foundation that you build is going to have to last for the next 10 or 20 years, just like your IPv4 foundation did that number of years ago right now. So don't carry all of your baggage from IPv4 back over into IPv6. Really give it a fresh look and understand how your business logic and how your old design informs your new design, but keep your new design hopefully separate and pertinent to the IPv6 world. And of course, the DDI tool will help you do that as well, especially when you have one that does IPv4 and IPv6 together. And then finally, we come down into implementation. This is a very complex diagram that really doesn't, I'm not going to go through the whole thing because it's meant to be a visual tool. When you think about the implementation, and you especially start thinking about dual stack, the protocol, the new world as we see it in the DDI space, you remember DNS DHCP, address to host name translation, and then IPAM, this idea of management. Your protocol should be independent of how you manage things. And it's going to have to be independent of how you manage things for the next X number of years until you remove IPv4 from your network. So as you start the planning process and you think about how you're going to implement your IPv6 infrastructure, one of the things that I would recommend is that we get away from this idea of immediately saying, okay, this device has this address. And we probably should move more towards the metadata as to who owns this device. or where is this device, or what's the MAC address of this device. Because it was easy to do in IPv4, right? If I created a DHCP reservation, what did I have immediately by doing that? Any takers? Just, if I scheduled a reservation, what piece of information do I usually need for a DHCP reservation? You need a MAC address, okay? So what happens in IPv6? Do we get MAC address for DHCP reservations anymore? No. It's a new identifier called a DUID. And so the technology itself may have you changing how you think about managing your devices. And a good tool, especially DNS DHCP IPAM, is going to bring all this stuff together, because you should be able to say, okay, device X has this IPv4 address, this IPv6 address, this MAC address, this DUID, and I should be able to navigate and look at all this information in real time. And that's not something that you're going to be able to do if you don't have a tool that gives it to you. So when you think about troubleshooting, when you think about understanding communications, and you think about even larger tracking and auditing and usage, which are big compliance initiatives for a lot of organizations, you really need to have that type of mindset, and you need to have the tool that's going to be able to do it. So in conclusion, if you look at DDI for your IPv6 migration process, one, you need to include it, because without DNS and DHCP, you're not going to have addresses and connectivity, although if you use Slack, that statement isn't completely true. But not only should you have a DDI solution that helps you, you should have one that is also going to assist with your migration as well. So have something that tracks your IPv6 networks. Have something that discovers the existing space, because not only is it about you putting the assignments in, or the IT staff putting the assignments in, it's about being able to discover the active stuff that's on the network. So if somebody comes to your network and introduces something, make sure that you can discover it. Make sure that you can remediate it. Make sure that you can bring it into this data infrastructure that you have. You get to integrate your dynamically assigned IP addresses. So stateful IP all comes back into the tool. And again, you have that global view of the data and the information that's on your network. You get your mapping of IP addresses to names. And again, central database, single source of information. And then finally, it does allow you, a good tool will allow you to track dual stack systems throughout your environment. And since we do advocate dual stack, this becomes very important, because you only need to go to one place to find the information about these devices on your network, instead of having to search in many, many different locations. So with that, I will open it up to questions. And if not, then it's only one person between you and the end of the day, and refreshments, which I hope for most of you means beer. Yes? Split brain from the perspective of?
Being able to support different IP ranges that have different visibilities, different subnets.
The question was, what kind of split brain support does BlueCat have specifically around visibility of different subnets? I don't know that there is a limit. We have the ability to have different configurations in our product, so you can actually keep those types of things separate from one another and provide management across overlapping spaces with the same tool. Yep. The question is multicast and anycast mappings. Those are should be included in an DDI tool as well. BlueCat does have that. We have the ability to track multicast spaces and anycast addresses as well. Certification of appliance, we're in the process of getting certified, but I don't know that we have our certification yet for IPv6. I will need to get back to you, because it's our product marketing department that's doing that. Anybody else? Yeah.
Clients being able to push keys into DNS stack.
Sorry, say that again?
Clients having the ability to push public keys into DNS stack and support that yet?
Yes, we support DNSSEC and the pushing of keys as well. I know that we've had some testing done. I don't have the specific details on it. If you give me your address, I can send you that information. Yep. All right. Thank you so much for the time this afternoon. I greatly appreciated it. And if you have any questions, I'll be around for a little bit and would love to chat with you. Thank you very much.